This seems a little bit related. You recently wrote a piece for CNN Money where you essentially say, that it's time to call a truce in the currency wars. And I was wondering if you could explain to our viewers, what is a currency war? And you argue that the idea is a little bit overblown. So can you talk about some of the kind of what's happening in the real world that is making people think that this is going on?
Okay, so the idea behind currency wars was that the finance minister of Brazil, Guido Mantega, said that the United States and other rich countries especially the United States, were purposefully trying to cheapen their currencies at the expense of countries like Brazil in order to do what you learned in my course, a beggar thy neighbor policy, where when you devalue your currency, you may help your economy, but at the cost of other economies whose currencies are strengthening. The United States was running an expansionary monetary policy, and that was completely appropriate for the time. A consequence of that was that the dollar depreciated, but it wasn't, a beggar thy neighbor policy explicitly. It had some of that effect. And to be fair, Brazil was in a very tough place. Many emerging market countries continued to grow relatively strongly after the outset of the Great Recession, while the advanced countries rather, started to falter. So the currencies of these emerging market countries like Brazil were appreciating. Part of that was that international capital was looking for a place to find high returns, and they were more apparent in a country like Brazil that still had strong growth. Part of it was they couldn't go to China because of the severe capital controls in place. So Brazil was in a tough place, and so the Brazilian government put in place capital controls, which I think were actually ineffective. And I've written a piece for Brookings on that. That'll be appearing this spring.
Great.
But also what happened was the real dollar rate went from about 1.6 to over 2. So there was sort of a natural weakening of the currency as the Brazilian economy started to slow. So the currency war rhetoric, I think, is unproductive. And it really could set up a situation like the 1930s where you have these series of competitive devaluations if it's taken too far. But the experience of Brazil with the subsequent weakening of its currency shows that the currencies will find their own natural equilibrium, and there are times when countries face appreciation and it's tough. Japan is another example. I mean, they didn't declare a currency war, but there's a lot of intervention against the yen in the fall of 2010 when I was at Treasury, and the yen sort of breached for a time 80 yen to the dollar and went down to 79. And they were very concerned about that in Japan. And their efforts to weaken the yen, and it really only went up to about 81 or 82 and sort of hovered there for a long time. But now we see today the yen at about 94. So, currencies can be affected by government policy, as we talked about in the course. But oftentimes the currency market is so large that if there's sort of an obvious bubble and people are waiting for the bubble to be pricked and to pop, sometimes governments can sort of affect that. But it would have been, the counterfactual is not that the bubble would have persisted for a very, very long time, but it would have been something maybe a week or two after or a month after that would change it.
Okay, so there's a sense that then there's countries are doing what is in their best interest, and it's not meant to be something that's deleterious to other countries. But there's a sense that there's a misperception. It seems like, and I was wondering, does the Treasury Department, the State Department does a lot of diplomacy on a lot of issues. When it comes to kind of these fairly technical issues about economic issues, currencies, is there a diplomacy that the Treasury Department does? Does it rely on the State Department to kind of erase some of these misperceptions, or does that diplomacy only happen when something like these issues arise?
No, my boss at Treasury, the Undersecretary for International Affairs, was Lael Brainerd, an incredibly hardworking, talented woman, and she's often referred to as the nation's financial diplomat.
Okay.
And when I went to Treasury, it became very apparent why that was the case. Lael is trained; she has a PhD in economics. She's taught at the Sloan School at MIT before she started government service. She's a very, very savvy economist, but also a very savvy politician.
Okay.
So it really was the case that Lael took the lead in negotiations and in diplomacy with respect to international financial issues, and also to a large extent, or to some extent, with respect to international trade issues as well, but not as much. And then we, as her staff, supported her in that. So I think there was a division between state and Treasury, and this was more of what Treasury did. Now, I imagine under other administrations with other people in place, that division could shift one way or the other.
Okay.
But certainly with somebody as capable and talented as Lael, Treasury really took the lead in a lot of those negotiations and a lot of those diplomatic efforts.
Great. Okay. You mentioned Japan. I was wondering. A lot of people have said, that the current situation in the U.S. or the current situation in Europe might be analogous to what happened in Japan. The lost decade. And I was wondering if you think that comparison has any merit.
It certainly has a potential for merit, but I think with what happened in Japan, that's an object lesson for people. So, Bernanke himself wrote about Japan in the 90s and what he thought Japan should do. And other people, who are influential also learned lessons from Japan. So I think by virtue of what happened in Japan, there was a lot of very aggressive action, especially at the outset of the crisis, to try to avoid that. So I don't see the United States really entering into that kind of a problem. And Japan itself, right now, with Shinzo Abe coming in and new head of the central bank and so on, they're trying to really shift their policies as well, to have a more aggressive monetary policy, accepting a higher rate of inflation, to have a more aggressive fiscal policy, to have structural changes as well. So it's a very interesting time for Japanese economics, as well as there seems to be a real effort to shift the economy and shift economic policy to tackle this problem that's been going on for 2 decades now.
Okay. And what about Europe? Do you think the comparison is a little more apt when it comes to Europe? Is Europe a little so you give the example of Great Britain and going for austerity. Has Europe learned the same lessons from Japan, do you think, or where are we at going forward?
Right. Well, Europe is different because it's not one country, obviously. Spoiler alert for those of you who are watching. When you come to Fletcher, you'll learn that Europe is not one country, nor is Africa one country. Europe is different in that there's a real diversity of opinion within Europe, and there has been, up until very recently, a real push for austerity for countries like Greece and Spain and Ireland by countries like Germany and the Netherlands. So the European problem is actually kind of a threefold problem. There's slow economic growth, there's a banking crisis, and there's a sovereign debt crisis.
It's the trifecta.
It's a trifecta, right. And we talked about this last semester in our course. It's really hard to solve any one problem without solving all three. And so the real challenge is that you can't solve just the banking crisis on its own because it's linked to the slow growth and to the debt crisis. And you can't solve the sovereign debt crisis on its own because it's linked to the banking problems and slow growth and so on. For the United States, we have banking issues, but they aren't as big as European banking issues. We have a deficit that's big by historical standards, but it's nothing like the debt problems facing many European countries. And I don't think we have the same. This growth since the beginning of the Great Recession has been disappointing, and the recovery has been disappointing. But I don't think we have the same sort of structural impediments to long-term growth as you have in some countries in Europe.
Okay.
So I think there too, it's an important distinction between what's going on in Europe and the United States. Certainly, both for Japan and Europe, there are lessons to be learned, but it's like the famous Mark Twain saying that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. So we have to learn where the rhymes are, but also to learn how one line is different from another in a poem and what's distinct between them.